Welcome back to the Foreign Desk. I'm Lisa Daftari. Doomed to repeat it, millennials and Zoomers, that's Gen Z, aren't learning Holocaust history. We'll also talk about the uptick in hate crimes against the Jewish community. Here to discuss this and break it all down for us is Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Associate Dean and Director of Global Social Action for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is also home to the Museum of Tolerance. He is a longtime activist for Jewish and human rights causes on 5 continents. In 1977, he came to Los Angeles from New York to help Rabbi Heyer found the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He's met with world leaders, including Pope Francis, presidents, foreign ministers, all to defend the rights of the Jewish people, combat terrorism, and of course, to promote multi-faith relations worldwide. He's a recognized expert on online hate and terrorism, founder of the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism, and in 2022, Rabbi Cooper was appointed vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which tracks violations of religious freedom around the world. And Newsweek named him one of 50 most influential rabbis in the United States. I'd have to very much agree with that. He is my go-to rabbi for many things, and someone I've had on my Fox News shows very frequently. There are not too many members of the clergy who have also their finger on the pulse of what's going on around the world. And Rabbi Cooper, you are undoubtedly one of the ones who I go to and is recognized around the world. So thank you for being here. And
my pleasure, an honor, Lisa.
Speaking of having a finger on the pulse and knowing what's going on around the world, you come to us tonight from Jerusalem, where they have just finished celebrating their Independence Day there today. So I thank you for being with us, and I look forward to our conversation.
So do I. Let's start.
Rabbi, I brought you here today, I mean, for many reasons. Obviously, what's going on, I think a lot of us have been following the uptick in crimes against Jews around the world, particularly in the United States. But first, a shocking new survey found that there's a lack of knowledge, Holocaust knowledge, among millennials and Gen Z. So there's a survey, it was actually conducted at the end of 2020, but just recently surfaced, which found a, quote, worrying lack of basic Holocaust knowledge among adults under 40, including over 1 in 10 respondents could not recall having ever heard the word Holocaust. According to the survey, which was conducted by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, respondents of millennial and Gen Z ages in all 50 states of the United States had no idea about the basic facts regarding the Holocaust, with 63% of those who were surveyed not knowing that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, and over half of those thinking that the death toll was fewer than 2 million. So, Rabbi, are you surprised by this poll, and what do you attribute this to?
Well, there are a lot of contributing factors, not least of which we're now about 8 decades after the end of the Holocaust. And I think not just when we talk about the Shoah, about the lessons we need to learn from that era, but in general, I think a lot of parents make a mistake that they can transmit their values and their concerns to the younger generation just by osmosis. You really have to take an activist position. And of course, their partners, the parents' partners, should be the schools and the teachers that are supposed to be exposing young people to important ideas. And I think, in terms of our museum, the Museum of Tolerance, which has hosted 7.5 million visitors in the last 30 years. The importance here maybe is much more important on what are the basic values and lessons we want our kids and grandchildren to learn, as opposed to the various statistics. And we try, I think, to focus in the museum experience on the personal. Obviously, survivors are extremely important. But I'll give you one example. We're now 81 years since the infamous Wannsee Conference. That was in January 1942, when 15 ministers of German state got together over drinks and in 90 minutes decided to mass murder 11 million Jews in Europe. They had a formal meeting and they had a vote. The man who led this effort was a man by the name of Reinhard Heydrich. who later on would be assassinated. And his assistant was the infamous Adolf Eichmann. Before that meeting, Heydrich said that he was worried because half of the people, 7 or 8 of those individuals, those ministers of state, had PhDs, had advanced education, and he wasn't sure they would be able to vote for the annihilation of an entire people. And he shared those concerns with Eichmann. The final tally was 15-0. So here's a lesson that everyone can relate to. Never confuse higher education or even intellect with ethics or morals. So I think if we're focus on, of course, the basics of what happened during the Shoah, especially for the Jewish people. Many young Jews don't even know who Simon Wiesenthal was. So we're looking, younger people are looking through the rear view mirror, and those events just seem so distant and frankly irrelevant to them, especially in a world dominated by social media. So it's up to us to come up with the strategies and tactics and to train teachers to be able to reach out properly to kids and also to encourage parents to be directly involved.
I think there's so much to unpack here, but mainly looking at this, and I absolutely agree with you in the sense that, of course, so much of this comes from a lack of education, so much comes from and a lack of awareness, etc. But you have Holocaust deniers, and do you think is that the obstacle that's standing in the way? Are people impenetrable when it comes to the Holocaust? So, for example, and we can talk about Israel in a bit, but you don't see people denying the War of 1812. You don't see people denying the Revolutionary War or the Armenian genocide. You see people denying the Holocaust. And now, as you said, this is 80 plus years behind us. We have survivors right now, victims of the Holocaust, who are in their 90s and above 100, who will not be here in a few years. So we won't even have these firsthand accounts. I mean, what's going to happen then? What are the obstacles that are standing in the way of people like yourself and the Simon Wiesenthal Center doing more, or actually, succeeding in your quest to educate people on this?
There's a lot to unpack even in your question, but I think a few things. First, Holocaust denial and deniers. There are two types of Holocaust deniers. There are those people who say, I don't believe that Auschwitz took place because I'm more comfortable believing it never happened. I don't like Jews. I don't want to hear these stories. And you just sort of cover your ears. And then you have people like the Ayatollah Khomeini, like ISIS, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, who say the Holocaust didn't happen, and given half a chance, they would finish the job. In other words, it's a kind of tactic to insult the dead, to threaten the living, and at the same time, really try to confuse the general population or just put out enough white noise out there. When you have a state like Iran, which uses its media, its cultural outlets to pound away that the Holocaust didn't happen, they're convinced that makes a difference.
Right.
Many of the Iranian people that I speak to say, oh, you mean the regime says the Holocaust didn't happen? That means it definitely did.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, you have that kind of an impact. I do think, though, if we're talking about the United States and the West, is that there is anti-Semitism out there. There's some, in terms of is this a race towards victimhood? Is important that the Jewish people be counted among the victims. We don't want to be victims anymore. We want to look forward and have a quality of life in the United States. We want to support the Jewish state. So it's not victimhood. So if you don't want the victimhood, what is it that you're trying to teach? And that, I think, is the point of departure, not only for young Jews, but for every visitor who comes to the museum. What we have to do is increase the number of films, the books. We have to, of course, find a way to memorialize the messaging of the survivors of the Shoah. If there ever was a group of people that had the moral right to become terrorists and tear everything down, it was the people who saw that the world didn't care when their families and loved ones were gassed and burned to death, and they barely survived. The fact that they embraced life, they made such a tremendous difference to the quality of life, not only in terms of the state of Israel, but in every Jewish community around the world and beyond. What an unbelievable and positive legacy. So it is a huge challenge. I think the most important thing is personalization, putting a human face on history,
Mhm.
and coming up with relevant messages and lessons to learn from that era.
Absolutely. And if you have an opportunity to visit the Museum of Tolerance, I highly suggest you do. Beautiful museum that is such really a tribute to the victims and to really telling the story in a way that's meaningful. Um,
Let me add one other
sure.
a point that might a point, historic point. Back, I guess it was in the 80s, Saddam Hussein gassed 5,000 of his citizens. 5,000 Kurds were put to death by Saddam. Most of the world leaders didn't say a word. Simon Wiesenthal spoke out, and what he told me then was, you know, when it comes to the crime of genocide and mass murder, there are two types of people who are paying attention: the good people who want to learn the right lessons to make sure it never happens again, and evildoers like Saddam Hussein. And when they see that the world doesn't respond, that it's a silent apathy, etc., that just guarantees there'll be more and more of people like him who are going to go down that path. And tragically, Mr. Wiesenthal was right. So I think the other piece of the overall lessons and messaging from those lessons from the Shoah is that silence is not an option. You really do have to speak out. When you contextualize that for young people, when you challenge them to think about it some more, then the sacrifices and heroism of people like Mordechai Analevich and Frank and so many others become relevant. That's when we have an opportunity to start reaching young people, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Right, and that was actually my next question is that you have given tours, right, at the museum to people who either have denied the Holocaust or have shown, to speak out against Jews, have shown to be anti-Semitic, etc. I think there were ideas about Kyrie Irving, the NBA player, who recently said some things that were unflattering to Jews, and ideas thrown around about him taking a tour of the museum. I mean, in your experience, does that tour does this raising awareness, bringing people's attention to things, giving them the facts, does it help turn anti-Semites?
Occasionally, sometimes people don't want to be confused by the facts because they have an agenda. And I would say that one of the, if you will, successes was someone like Nick Cannon, who gave a lot of airtime to someone who was just mapping Farrakhan's hatred for the Jewish people and denial of our history and of our values. And I think Nick Cannon, for me, was someone who I said, well, if you want to learn all about anti-Semitism, tune into his podcast. And within an hour or two, he had, reached out. I told him, don't apologize to me. You have to apologize to the Jewish people.
Hmm.
He opened up, and that started a relationship in which he eventually and pretty quickly not just apologized, but went the extra mile, learned a lot more, exposed himself, to these issues. And I think where a lot of young people who are linked into social media,
Mhm.
where there's no filter, there's no historic context, there's no librarian, there's no teacher to say you got it wrong. That's the perfect kind of context and setting for young people to be influenced with all kinds of conspiracy theories
Right.
and alternative, quote unquote, alternative truths. So we have
Right.
to try to reach those people. I
Right.
think the majority of our work has to be focused on the 95% of the population that doesn't really know very much, doesn't know why it should. generally apathetic, and don't wake up every morning with Jew on the brain.
Right.
So occasionally we'll turn some of the anti-Semites by exposing them to the truth or to a great survivor. But the majority of our work has to be with the people who are just sitting on the sidelines and say, like, why is this relevant to me in any way, shape, or form?
Right. And just to quantify a lot of what you're saying, we're looking at hate crimes against Jews, especially in the last 3 years, being the number one targeted group in America, up 400%. And when you look at the population of Jews across the world, particularly in America, against the general population, this is a small ratio. I mean, you look at the fixation and that.
Right. We're about 2.4% of the population, maybe, and about 63% of all hate crimes, according to Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, has targeted our community.
Right.
So when we think about, obviously, we're concerned about why this is happening. There are numerous factors. First, this trend already started before COVID, and the focus turned to the places where there had large Jewish populations, like the religious communities in Brooklyn, New York, Williamsburg, and Crown Heights, and Flatbush. You had similar situations in Chicago.
Mhm.
And in Los Angeles, we had some horrific incidents as well, where the focus was an easy target, somebody who was obviously Jewish. We've
Mhm.
been dealing with that problem in Europe for 15 years.
Right.
This is relatively new and obviously deeply disturbing phenomenon. It's one of the reasons we keep calling for a special a task force from the FBI so that we can figure out, when is it a lone wolf? When is it one person who's gone off the deep end? When is it tied to a hate group? And when is it linked to a worldwide effort to spread the propaganda of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah?
Right. Right, and you add to that the left and the right, the far left, the far right, the media, members of Congress who are hell bent on smearing Israel's name and diminishing Jews wherever they can. Recently, a UK member of the Labour Party also, coming out and saying Jews do not experience racism. They might be discomforted, and that's all. But that brings me to the point of where people try to kind of differentiate between, Jew hatred or anti-Semitism and then it being anti-Zionist, meaning we might have issues with the state of Israel, but we don't have issues with Jews. But do you allow for that differentiation? And why do you think that this has become such a phenomenon? Why the fixation?
Well, for one thing, the Jewish people, when I start hearing, for example, white privilege, I don't know. My grandparents came to the United States. I think between the four of them, maybe they had $10. So we don't fit into a narrative that's being pushed by elements of the progressive movement because they're pushing an agenda that has to do with what color your skin is.
Right.
Well, if you walk down the street in Jerusalem and you get every skin tone there is for Jews, we're not a race, we're a people. And color is not the key factor.
Mhm.
There are people who are promoting the idea of equity. Well, we've been taught the idea of equality. And
Right.
one of the key elements of our education at the Museum of Tolerance, what we're trying to push, we have been for all these decades, is critical thinking, personal responsibility. The other issues are important. There is discrimination in society. People do suffer because of their sexual orientation sometimes and because the color of their skin. Those are problems in society, but the way to approach it is to deal with the problems and not to convert those problems into a new category of victimhood and who gets to the front of the line and
Yeah.
how do you divide people. I mean, obviously, everything that the Wiesenthal Center Museum stands for is to bring people together, but not by demanding everybody thinks the same way. So we
Right.
don't fit into those boxes. And
Well,
on top of it, maybe once upon a time you can be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite. Those days are long gone. the largest Jewish community in the world is in Israel. That number is growing. And for anybody who's ever prayed in a Jewish prayer book, well, every other page, you have that desire that's been prayed over for thousands of years of return to Zion. For us, it's not just the political approach of, supporting a particular state. It's also the core of our religion, our original language, and our values. So I think you'll find more and more, especially with anti-Semites, both in the far right and also in terms of Hamas and other extremists within the Arab and Muslim world. They gave up that difference a long time ago.
Right.
They now target people they call Sabbath pigs, meaning religious Jews. And that kind of language, raw, genocidal language, which used to be only applied right here in the Middle East. Well, today everything's on social media. So 5 minutes after the latest stabbing or shooting or running over of a Jew in Israel is viral all over the world. There's no differentiating anymore between Jews and Zionists, although there are also Jews, unfortunately, who are anti-Semites, who hate what we stand for and, seek to sort of fit into a different narrative. And that's their right in the United States to do so, but not to confuse anything. The vast, overwhelming majority of Jews, even if they've never been to Israel, even if they don't follow the daily politics, they know that Israel's a very important place for them. And there is one lesson that Jews do know about, including kids coming home from Ivy League colleges having suffered discrimination and intimidation, is the big difference between today and 80 years ago is today there is a Jewish homeland. And if you're having problems at the University of Chicago, you may want to try the Technion in Israel. It's probably a better school.
Right. And as I always say, if anyone tells you they don't have a problem with Jews, but they have a problem with the government in Israel, ask them to name you 3 of the policies they don't agree with. And I bet you they won't even be able to.
But if you need to crash course in that, you just come to Israel and hop into any taxi cab. Don't worry. The driver will give you 15 things they're unhappy with that day. This is a rock and roll democracy, sometimes a blood sport. You'd like it to be a little bit better mannered. But it is what it is. Nonetheless, as we've seen both with the amazingly difficult 24 hours of Memorial Day here, then transforming into the pride of being part of a Jewish state, a state that's now 10 million people. They say by 2045 there may be 24 million people in Israel, 20 million of them Jews. I'm looking forward for the next couple of generations to really begin to build on what's flourished so far, and to really fulfill the Jewish dream, the Jewish destiny, which I think primarily is going to be driven from this zip code right here in Jerusalem.
Right. I mean, it's not going to be from Washington, D.C., from the looks of things. You pointed to a few things that are quite important in the context of our conversation, because we started out the conversation talking about Gen Z and millennials, people who are under 40, not knowing. And I would even take it to under 25, because, we're looking at college campuses and social media. And what the dichotomy that I see over and over again is how there's such a push to support social justice causes. And what bigger or better social justice cause than to support Jews, who are such a small minority, but yet that cross-sectionality that's promoted is to say, well, if you care about gays, then you should hate Jews. If you care about blacks, then you should hate Jews. If you marched for George Floyd, then you should hate Jews and be against Israel. And, that just keeps going. And these are the talking points that are perpetuated, and also by funny that they claim the Jews own Hollywood, because you'd think Hollywood would do a better job at defending the Jews and defending Israel in their narratives. But I know you also do a lot of media work, whether it's television, doing these types of interviews, but also writing op-eds, putting these very important points on paper for people to read, or on the web, more accurately these days. I mean, what role do you see media playing, or not playing, in the course of this conversation?
I just find that in the work that I do, which is usually getting the bad news early and often, that it's just cheaper to write op-eds than go to a shrink. Uh, it is,
Well
as you
said.
know, Lisa, you're one of the people who's right there on the cutting edge. The media is not interested to hear what we have to say. We're not, in some ways, we just, again, don't fit the orthodox narrative of the day, and you have to work very, very hard and then find the outlets that will give you the opportunity to be heard. You probably hear this from many people, many causes, many politicians, etc. But especially for the Jewish community, there is the beginning of a wake up, let's say at the LA Times about anti Semitism. Well, if two Jews in consecutive days are shot
Mhm.
as they walk out of a West Side synagogues, the LA Times put a phenomenal writer on it, and he wrote a spectacular piece.
Right.
But insofar as a sensitivity, an identification with the struggles of the Jewish community, let's say in Los Angeles, I don't find a lot of that at the LA Times. They've been around 45 years. And it hurts not having that kind of an affinity and that kind of relationship. It doesn't mean that you give it a free pass when things go wrong. But right in LA, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, you can go right through the top uh, traditional media. It's a real struggle. The huge difference has come, obviously, that we have now the opportunity to use internet technology to speak, to audiences literally all over the world. But I also think that, and I'm involved in volunteering with a group called Connect Israel, which takes 20 and 30 something successful American Jewish business people, hooks them up with their opposite numbers in Israel, and then we pick an Arab country to go to and spend some time together. I think what many young people, young Jews who maybe just didn't have the education, are beginning to experience. I'll give two examples. I tell this to everyone, when you go to Dubai and you have a meeting or you have a call and with a potential business person, and they say, okay, why don't we get together for that meeting on Saturday morning at about 11 o'clock?
Mm.
I just tell them, Israelis and Americans, don't take the meeting at 11. Just say, look, it's Shabbat, it's the Jewish Sabbath. Let's meet on Sunday. Now, why do I suggest that? Here's why. 450,000 Israelis have already visited the United Arab Emirates. There's so much curiosity to break through that psychological and historic barrier. I said, don't you think the people on the other end have the same curiosity? So they'll understand why you're postponing, but then their first question is going to be, well, tell me about Shabbat. What does it mean to you? Or,
Mhm.
if you want to only eat fish, well, why don't you? And if you don't have answers to those questions, maybe a good time to start then. I think
Right.
the other part of it is many young Jews are coming home at the end of the school year, or sometimes, calling home to mom or dad, paying a fortune for these education, and just pouring out their hearts. They're intimidated, they're shunted aside, they're purged to places like University of Southern California, and for many of them, it's their first experience as Jews. And I've always felt this from a very young age. We should never let the anti Semites define who
Mm.
we are. So, part of the challenge here for young people and slightly older people, for whatever reason, either didn't take the opportunity, didn't have the exposure. Here is a constant of Jewish history. To the anti-Semite, they don't care what your level of Jewishness is. They're going to hate you anyway. My view is build out your Jewishness based on the very rich traditions that you have access to. You'll be happier, your kids will be happier, and you'll be better positioned to defend the Jewish people.
Mhm. I mean, you've done such a tremendous job at defending the Jewish people, and unfortunately, we're coming up against our last question. But you're such a pro; you pretty much segued me right there. Um, if we're looking at young people and really doing what we can with the platforms that we can, you really are at the helm of an institution, a museum, a platform. You're a branded personality to really pass the baton, pass the torch, really, do what you can to really change the course of the next generation. Taking a look around, I mean, you've spoken at the UN, you know the challenges there. I mean, it's an uphill battle. You look at the media and how we battle that machine every single day. You look at Hollywood, we live right here in Los Angeles and we see what's around us. You look at the world, I mean, you've met with leaders from Jordan and Indonesia and Sudan and Egypt, and the list goes on. You know all the challenges that are out there, but you're also looking at these polls and these numbers, and you see the crises that face Jews and the state of Israel. Going forward, will the Simon Wiesenthal Center and yourself and Rabbi Heyer and everybody else who's a part of this, will you have to, and how would you change your approach or evolve in a way to meet these new challenges?
Well, I would just say two things. Jewish education, however you define it, it can needs to be bolstered, needs to be pushed. Every Jew should visit Israel at least once to understand what it is that so many people want to take away from us. But the other piece of this, and I say this as a religious Jew, as someone who lives in the diaspora, is that we have an obligation to reach out to our neighbors, not during the time of crisis, but just every day. Like say, we want to have full funding for police, not just for West LA, for everybody in Los Angeles. There are poor that need to be taken care of. There are relationships that need to be built out. We can't assume that our neighbors are going to stand up for us when we have a crisis if they don't know who we are. So we live in a democracy. It's a sin not to be involved in a democracy. So if we sit back and close our ears and eyes to others and only scream out when we feel we're under attack, we're doomed because we're a small minority. But I think what Judaism, the Jewish people, stands for, in terms also of the greater universal concepts, we have a lot to share. We have a lot to give, and I can report to you from all over the world, and I've been all over the world. The operative term for the people I meet, 9 out of 10 times, isn't hatred; it's curiosity. They want to know first and foremost what makes you tick. Why does a Jew in Toronto care about a Jew in Tel Aviv? That's a good place to start. If you can't answer that question, maybe it's time to start looking. So, for the internal part of our community, is that Jews have to care for each other. I mean, we're family, which means you don't always like your siblings, but they are your brothers and sisters. You have to take that attitude, cut a little slack for our fellow Jews, and take pride in the fact that here we are. Thousands of years later, all these other empires are gone. And there we are, those pesky Jews building up the Holy Land and making a difference all over the world. So this isn't a time to go into a ghetto. This is a time to know who you are, learn who you are. Now with social media and the internet, you can pretty much educate yourself. Make sure you visit Israel, and make sure you care for the people down the block who are not of the Jewish faith as well.
Well, actually, before I let you go, speaking of people down the block or across the oceans, I will be accepting an award in 2 weeks from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who has decided very beautifully to honor the women of Iran who have been fighting a revolution for the past 7 months. And I know that the Simon Wiesenthal Center has honored the women of Iran. You did an event for International Women's Day that I had the privilege to be a part of, and now I will humbly accept the award on behalf of all Iranian women. It comes at such a auspicious time as the exiled Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, just completed a
Yes.
very well-rounded trip in Israel. I think you guys overlapped on your trips there. You speak a bit about, the Simon Wiesenthal Center's really their attention to the women of Iran and their connection to really bridging these two communities together.
Right. So first of all, Lisa, you're the perfect person to be the ambassador for the women we don't know yet, and to send them a signal that we care, not only for the small remaining number of Jews in Iran, but for the people of Iran. This is a critical time, and unfortunately, many political leaders, including in the United States, have deflected or rejected their responsibility to stand with the amazingly courageous women. They bring the kids into the world. They know what they have right now isn't acceptable. What courage! And at least for the extent that we can, and as you know, you'll have a lot of captains, a lot of leaders of the entertainment industry will be there that night. We want to educate them. The people in that audience can make a difference in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the reasons we selected it. I also traveled extensively in the Gulf region. When you have lunch 20 kilometers away from Iran, it does, gain your attention. So we're at a tipping point historically. We have to do what we can to promote the goals of the people of Iran before, God forbid, Israel is forced, and maybe UAE and others are forced to make existential
Mhm.
decisions that could land up ruining that blessed land, for 100 years. So
Yeah.
we're right there, and we're just blessed that the women of Iran, whatever their religion is, have had the courage to stand up. We owe it to them, and that's why we're doing it.
Well, thank you very much. And I know that you were right there, front and center for the Abraham Accords. I think I saw you at the White House on that day. I hope that you will be there because you absolutely did merit the honor to be a part of the Cyrus Accords, which hopefully will one day connect the people of Iran and the people of Israel, just like the meaningful relationships that you described between the people of the UAE and Israel. Hopefully, one day soon, we will see this manifest between the people of Iran and the people of Israel as well. And I thank you, Rabbi, for standing up for so many wonderful causes, for being such an ambassador, for being such a catalyst, and doing such wonderful work around the world. And I wish you all the best. I encourage all of you at home to look up the Simon Wiesenthal Center, all of their events, their exhibits, go to the museum, check it out. Tell people you know about this and follow Rabbi Cooper online. He does some wonderful writing, as he said, therapy. His rants are wonderful, and he says it like it is. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us. For those of you at home who'd like to subscribe to our weekly podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. And to subscribe for our daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com. See you all next week.